And give it about 10-15 seconds. Okay, you should be live.
All right, well, welcome everyone to another episode of What's the Tea. This is our weekly show. We've been doing this. This is episode 42, so at least for 42 weeks now, which is very exciting. We do this at Tuesdays at 2 p.m. And this month of February is Teen Dating Violence Awareness Month. So that's been the theme, working with youth and kind of doing a little bit of education around teen dating violence awareness. Today, we're going to take a slightly different angle, although I am wearing my one orange shirt. So if you saw me wear this last time, I only have one orange shirt. I don't wear this every day. I just wore it for the episode. But I'm very happy to have Carol here with us. She's one of our associate directors. And welcome to the show, Carol. Thanks for being here with us.
Thank you. I'm sorry I had no orange in my wardrobe. I realized that when I was trying to dress for this morning, but I'm super excited to be here with you today.
That's no worries. Thank you for being here, of course. And orange is a hard color to match with things, I'm finding.
Yeah.
So just to get started, I want to talk about a lot of things like, if you saw our teaser, we're going to talk about the school to prison pipeline. We're going to talk about restorative justice. Very quickly, Carol's been on here one time before. She's a recurring guest, but I just want to give her the floor for just 1 minute and just let her know, let everyone know what is it that you do in your role with South Suburban Family Shelter?
Sure. So as the associate director, what I really focus on is working with the direct service programs to ensure that there's a coordinated approach to how we provide services to our clients, to ensure that there's consistency across the different programs, and to be the lead of a really strong management team that really spends a lot of time focusing on how best to meet the needs of the community and our clients. In addition to that, I work to ensure that we are maintaining compliance with all the rules and regulations of our various funding sources, state, federal, private funding, those kind of funding sources. And then I also get the privilege of being able to represent South Suburban Family Shelter and the DV community at large on various boards, committees, and work groups. So I don't take up too much time. That's kind of my role in a nutshell.
Great. So we'll swing back and talk a little bit more with Carol in just a few minutes and talk about kind of her early career days and working with youth. And that'll be one of the main themes today is strategies and frameworks to work with youth and make sure that they're able to develop positively. So real quickly, I'd like to just kind of give a brief overview of this concept of the school to prison pipeline. So let's go ahead and do that. And if anyone has questions regarding this concept, feel free to leave them in the description down below, and we'll get to them towards the end of the show. So the school to prison pipeline, it's sort of a concerning national trend or kind of like a phenomenon. So it's not something that's exactly like, it's black and white, like this is exactly how it's happening, because you have to look at different trends and things that are happening within the school system and the prison system to kind of put your finger on it. So in essence, it is a process by which children and adolescents go from public schools and they're then funneled into the juvenile prison system. And a lot of that has to do with school discipline policies and basically what's happening to them at large. So I'll talk a little bit about some of the reasons why we see this transition between the public school system going into the prison system. And one of those main reasons were this concept of zero tolerance policies, where there was a strict punishment that had to fit the crime every time. So if you did, like, this was your third case of disorderly conduct or you started a fight in school, the zero tolerance policy would be there's there's no flexibility in the rules. It's a very rigid system where you do this and then the punishment always fits the crime exactly as it was. And this really started about in the 90s. And if you look at some of the stats, you see a huge spike in suspensions um, and a lot of other trends starting in the 90s. So one thing I will point out, it's important to know that if you look at it on a large scale, pretty much every way you slice it, you see Black and Latino youth being affected more, um, just more dramatically larger numbers than their white counterparts. So here are a few different statistics. I'm getting these from the Civil Rights Data Collection. And I want to talk about specifically a lot today about Illinois. That's where South Suburban Family Shelter is, and that's our state public school system. So suspensions for out of school, this is one of the main things because of course, if a student is suspended out of school, that's more likely for them to get expelled in the long run. And if you're more likely to get expelled before you can graduate high school or even junior high, then you're more likely to end up in the prison system based on, what are your options at that point if you're not going to get back into school. So there were almost 8 times as many suspensions for Black males as there were for white males. And then for females, there were 9 times as many suspensions for Black females as there were for white females. And this was in the state of Illinois, and that was 2011 and 12. And if you look at somewhere like Chicago Public Schools, in that same school year, there were 4,000 arrests of students in the school system. And if you do a little division, that's about 24 per day. So you can imagine 24 students every single day in that system were being arrested. And also locally, unfortunately, Thornton Township at the same time had 47 out of school suspensions for 100 students. Now, that doesn't mean half the schools getting suspended. That means there's a lot of repeat suspensions. But by the numbers, there's 47 suspensions for 100 students. And they actually have brought those numbers down a lot for a number of reasons of how they changed their policy. So I think a lot of these trends were really concerning and still are concerning, but they're getting better, I would say. And I think it's hard to tell exactly how much they're improving because we're always looking at stats in the past and then we're making sense of it. And if you take something like 2020 and even 2021, if you look at a chart, the numbers will probably just drop dramatically because kids were on Zoom and the pandemic first hit in March. So if you're looking in terms of like graduation rates, I would imagine more people were graduating because all they had to do was just show up on their Zoom call and, hey, I can graduate now. I don't have to do all these senior projects, this and that. So it's hard to tell exactly where the trends are, but they were improving for a whole host of reasons, which I want to get towards the end. I'll keep describing the school to prison pipeline for another minute or so. Another factor in all these increased suspensions and kids ending up in the prison system was kind of using school resource officers as the first line of discipline in a lot of instances. So starting in about 1997 to 2007, that one decade span, there was almost a 40% increase in hirings of school resource officers. And the vast majority of these arrests in the schools were due to disorderly conduct. So a very small percentage of these arrests were for weapons or physical altercations, and more so, acting out, not following school rules, being disruptive, things along those lines. And it's not to say that we can just, we just kick the officers out and the problem will be solved, because we have to think about why are the students acting out and how can we best address them. And I think something that can help a lot is restorative justice. Because if you consider training for like a school social worker or school counselor versus a police officer, they're trained to abide by the law and enforce the law, and a lot of times they're not specialized to work with youth, and they're being asked like to arrest the student because this is what's happening. So a lot of times it's what they're asked to be doing as well. So that's another factor as well. And I think I will stop there because I want to get into trends that we can make more positive and kind of disrupt the school to prison pipeline, and what practices should we be using if we're working with youth. And I've also been talking for quite a bit, so I'm going to bring Carol back into the discussion. So we've had this conversation. This is like the third time we've kind of gone through this discussion a little bit. So Carol and I have an idea of where we're going to go, and we're going to put a bow on top of it at the end. But let's go back to Carol. And Carol, can you talk to us about your experience working with youth, especially at the beginning of your career?
Yeah, so I'm going to take you back just a couple of years. So it really started, I started my career when I was an undergrad, and I was able to work in a medium security prison for men through their psychology department. And even though that started with adults, I kind of feel like at this moment I have kind of bookended my career with starting with adults in criminal justice, working with youth, and then kind of like where I am now, I'm going back to working with adults in the criminal justice system in some way. But my work through the medium security prison led me to be able to work at a progressive rural juvenile court system. And I started as a detention counselor, which allowed me to, my job was to monitor youth prior to and after their court hearings and their sentences. But more than just this being a jail, this court system really tried to come up with some really progressive and newer ways to address the cycle of youth circling into their court system. So attached to this juvenile court system, they actually had a group home, and I was able to work at this group home, and it was for youth that had been on probation, and they were headed towards the state prison system if something didn't change. They were repeat offenders. Their crimes had started to become progressively worse, and their family systems were not able to maintain them. So they were pulled out and they were put into this group home where we could really focus on how to kind of disrupt that cycle for them, be a support system for them, be a support system for their families, in order for them to get off of probation and get back into school and be a successful student and successful in life. In addition to that, this court system created a diversion program. And it was for exactly those youth, Zach, that you were just talking about. This was for first-time unruly and misdemeanor offenses, where they would come in front of the court system and the court would try and divert them from having a criminal sentence. And so the diversion officer, and I was one of them, we became the prosecutor, the defense, the judge, and ultimately the probation officer, where we were able to slow down, take some time to really evaluate what the crime was, evaluate what the circumstances were around this youth and what the crime was, and then to really look at what the barriers were that the youth and the family were facing. Then we were able to create a plan to try and address all of those barriers as much as possible, whether that was a drug and alcohol evaluation, whether that was mental health counseling, whether that was private tutoring, whether that was trying to get a youth set up with an IEP or a 504 plan through the school system. And then as a diversion officer, we would monitor their progress and we would support them through the different steps. And if, like I said, if they were successful, then their charges were dropped, which was just a really interesting way of having addressed this, like you say, this pipeline and trying to prevent that. I also, in a different agency, I worked as an in-home therapist and then an outpatient therapist, and really working with a lot of youth and a lot of families that had, they were struggling with school performances. They were struggling with, once they would start to get behind in the school system because of the in-school suspensions or the out-of-school suspensions, then how do they catch up? You know, how are they able to get back into the groove of things, especially if the school had started seeing them kind of as the bad kid. And unfortunately, a lot of those youth also had juvenile court involvement. So trying to work with them to figure out how did they get here and what's their plan? How are they going to try and break this cycle? And then we're fast forward a couple of years, and now here I am working at South Suburban Family Shelter. And one of the direct programs that I work with is our PAY program, right? And so that is for adult DV offenders. So like I said, you know, these are a lot of these individuals that are in our PAY program have had these exact same struggles that we're talking about now. They haven't been able to disrupt these cycles, and now they have landed yet again in front of the court system for a different offense, and this is a DV offense. And sometimes they have the same barriers that they had way back when they were youth.
Yeah, absolutely. And catching a lot of different themes. One, especially with the PAY program, is when there's no real proper intervention, or as you're saying, you're putting up all these supports for these juveniles when they're in the court system, and you're strategizing ways to kind of help break that cycle. When that doesn't happen, they end up somewhere else in a slightly similar situation, like in a PAY program. So in terms of like protective factors, something that mitigates the risk of kind of these repeat offenses, what do you think were some of the most effective strategies? And with that said, we talk about recidivism a lot, re-entering the prison system or the court system. What supports do you think were really effective, and what would you said some criminal charges were dropped? So what would the success stories more so look like versus the typical pattern?
Right. Well, I think that one of the things, kind of focusing on what you had said when you started giving these statistics, which that's the first time that I've heard some of these statistics, and they were shocking. For us to talk about an average of 24 arrests in the CPS system per day, right? And I think that is one of the systems that if you've got a big, like I said, the county that I worked in was a small rural county, right? And so because they had less numbers of individuals, I think they had the capacity to try on new programs. And I think that when you've got a bigger county or a bigger school system that are probably already strapped for funds and strapped for resources, I think then it becomes harder for them to be able to try innovative and progressive programs. Even the restorative justice, that takes resources, it takes training, it takes funding to be able to do something like that. So I think that's one of the barriers that I think that I see often through my career is when you have systems that are facing multiple issues such as poverty and a lack of resources, then I think that it's really, that lends itself to these youth really being caught in that recidivism cycle. And I think that what often goes along with that is that they don't have a real, their support system, their protective factors are disrupted. They might never have had a strong protective factor around them. And then they start in a system, which leads to a second system. And, then it's just a snowball. It's just a snowball rolling down the hill and just gathering speed until they are in a system, the prison system, and that's a really hard one to come back from. That's a really hard system to break out of and be successful on the other side of that. So in my rambling, I kind of lost what your question was to me.
I think you put your finger on something that's really important in terms of just the sheer numbers in some of these schools of how many people they're trying to address with limited funding. And you really sparked my mind thinking about our prevention program and different school environments that we go into, because we're not just in Homewood. Occasionally we venture out towards Chicago or the communities right outside of Chicago, and sometimes you're at a school and it's like there's so much going on, like I've walked like right through the front door into the office, and like there's kids in and out, and there's so much going on, and they just say, hey, just sign the paper, and they're just shuffling kids in and out because there's just a higher threshold of chaos, and um, not enough adults in the building to really work with every single person. So a lot of times they get shuffled along versus, like you're saying, like a county like Cook County that's so big versus just outside of there, every student, they'll know every student's name. When they come to school, it's not through a metal detector. They're being greeted by the school staff and the principal, and everyone's there on time, and the bell schedule means something, and everyone's a little bit more orderly, which is always nice. You can only be so orderly when you have a building full of kids, but a little bit of order goes a long way.
Right. Yeah. And I think that, one of the things that you and I had talked about, when we were kind of prepping for this, is the fact that not to beat up on school systems, that they have so many demands on them, right? And they're in a process of year by year, budget by budget, they're getting budget cuts, but yet the expectations of what they're supposed to be providing for students keeps going up and up, right? And the curriculum and the state testing that people, that the students have to pass, and funding attached to, that state testing results, and so forth and so on. So I think that the schools really have they've got a lot on their plates that they're trying to address. And so it doesn't surprise me that, back in the 90s, the approach was, well, we might have to sacrifice a few in order to save the most. I'm not saying that it was the best approach, but that zero tolerance, it was an attempt to maybe put the fear into students that, oh, they had better toe the line. Obviously, that didn't work out, the way that they probably had wanted it to. So I think that that school systems do have to kind of take a look at what do they have on their plate, and what type of student do they have in their classrooms, and what really are the various factors that they have to provide for them in order for them to be successful, besides the reading, the writing, and the arithmetic kind of idea.
Yeah, and I'm really grateful you mentioned that, because just thinking back to the beginning, I'm talking about some of the negatives in the school system, but so I don't want anyone to get the wrong idea, because schools are definitely doing everything that they can with the resources that they have. And you're exactly right when it comes to kind of how these zero tolerance policies evolved. Sometimes you have a classroom and it's one person, and you just know if that one person was not in that classroom, then everyone else will benefit greatly. But it's what you do when that student leaves the classroom, of course. But in terms of funding, we were talking before, a lot of school districts have one social worker, and there's 2 or 3 buildings, and they're there 1 or 2 days a week, and they're not available necessarily if a student is. And the thing with disruption, of course, is there's always a reason behind it. it's, you know, we don't want to just label kids like, oh, this is a bad kid, or this kid's just got this problem or that problem, um, because you have to look at, you know, were they exposed to violence? Were they exposed to trauma? What is their morning look like before they're arriving to school? And, you know, they might have had just a horrendous night too, which whatever's happening in the community or at home, and then they're walking into the building, and then you say, well, we just got to get this kid out of here. So there's definitely um, challenges that schools have, and even with the social emotional learning aspect, you know, there are state requirements for, you know, reading, writing, arithmetic, that sort of thing. So there's only so many hours in the school day where um, you can pull kids out of school and them still hit their academic goals. So I appreciate you
Mhm.
reminding me on that one.
Right, right. And I think that, you know, when we talk about, you know, and I'm so glad that you brought up the idea, or, you know, the fact that so many of these youth are have been exposed to all sorts of traumas in their life, right? And that's one of the things that I certainly have seen through my career, is that so many of the parents have such burdens themselves, such barriers themselves, that they're trying to address. They're trying to take care of their own, you know, trauma responses, in addition to trying to parent at the same time. And parenting, you know, anyone who is on Facebook who is a parent or has a parent certainly understands that parenting is hard, right? And so when you as a parent or a caregiver are depleted in any way, then it's really hard to be there for your child who is struggling, right? And so I think that that's another factor that I think made the difference between what was that trend for students that became recidivistic through, you know, school suspensions or expulsions, or, you know, the court system, and those that were able to break the cycle in some way. You know, you had asked me before about like the successes in the diversion program. And I really think a lot of that came back to what were the support systems around this youth, right? Whether it's family, or whether it's caregivers, or whether it is, you know, guardians, or whoever that may be. I think that when you've got a system, and what I saw a lot is that kids who might not automatically have this support system around them, the ones that were able to break this cycle are the ones that were able to create it in some other manner. They were able to find an adult that took an interest in them, and were able to start helping them build that support system around them and those protective factors around them, and be a support system to the parents or the guardians or whoever was helping raise that child, right? So it became that one school counselor who was willing to step up, or that probation officer who was willing to go the extra mile, or that family therapist who was just like, you know, I'm going to hound you to make sure that you're coming to my sessions, and we're going to figure out how to make this happen no matter what, right? It's those programs and those ideas that kind of go outside of the norm. You know, before I became an in-home therapist, I didn't even know that existed. I just thought that people come to you and they lay out on your couch and they tell you your problems, and you give, you know, they give you the check and then they leave, kind of idea, right? But that whole idea of an in-home therapist is we went into people's homes and we worked on trying to preserve that family dynamic and improve that in family system and support, so that those children could be successful and could break whatever negative cycles that they were starting to get caught up in.
Yeah, those little things that people do can have such a big impact. And I actually want to talk a little bit about some of that. This kind of idea of restorative justice. I don't think I've like explained it, but we've like danced around it for the last 30 minutes here. So I want to give a couple of examples of what this might look like. So I gave the example of whether you're being greeted by metal detectors or teachers and administrators when someone walks in. But I think the core of restorative justice is you're focusing on repairing social harm rather than punishing. So you talked about that with the court system where, you know, if they met their probation requirements, they're repairing that social harm, and rather than just suspending for the rule breaking. So an example of that would be an out of school suspension versus, well, you got together with the other student that you were in a fight with. Both people came to some kind of agreement. There was an apology made, and maybe one of the students or two of the students agreed to like help clean up a classroom, or, you know, clean the cafeteria after lunch hour or something. And then there's no suspension. Everyone's back in school. And maybe there was an ongoing problem between two students that actually got resolved that way. Whereas maybe you just suspend one student, the problem's not really fixed because that student comes back in 3 days, and, you know, these two students have a bigger problem now. So that would be one other example. And then one other thing I wanted to talk about, which is really good news, was this Senate bill that came out in 2015 in the Illinois legislature, which was Senate Bill 100. And we're still, I think, working out the kinks with a lot of this because we've eliminated zero tolerance policies through this law. And there were much stricter restrictions on using out of school suspensions, and anything that was longer than 3 days out of school suspension required to exhaust all resources, you know. And of course, with the law, some, you know, you have to read and you have to infer a little bit what some of this means. But there were also just some weird things like monetary fines for students through arrest, and then they have to pay a fee. It's like, well, how old are they? They don't have a job, and maybe their parents don't have any money either. So it's like just getting rid of things like that can make a huge difference. And I will say, to play devil's advocate and argue for like not being so lenient, is that you never want a school to, or a student to just think like, well, I can do anything now, and I can see like no one's getting in trouble. So there's no consequences, so I can kind of just do what I want and I'm not getting kicked out. That I think that's a possibility, but I don't think it's the norm. I mean, I've seen schools get a little out of hand, like when I've done prevention, where you could tell they kind of knew they weren't going to get in trouble. But I think I would prefer that than just kicking kids out. And I think you're about to.
Yeah, I mean, I think that like my brain is just going all over the place with all sorts of ideas on this. And I think part of it comes back to the basic human nature as far as what is the message that you want? What is the lesson that you want the students to learn from this? What is the skill that you want them to develop, right? And so I think when you talk about, you know, addressing the social emotional health as opposed to punishment, I think that's huge, right? I mean, like we all, what is the message from punishment? Does that really work as far as, and that's a whole other, you know, hour and a half or whatever, as far as like, you know, like punishment, does it really work? And what is the messages that youth are really receiving from that? But that idea that when the schools are trying to really focus much more on social emotional health, that's, you know, conflict resolution skills as part of it. That is empathy development. And so it's kind of like that idea of like, you don't learn how to walk in a day, you don't learn how to ride a bike in a day. So do you learn how to do conflict resolution in a day? Probably not, right? And so I think that there's that balance, and as far as being able to do a restorative justice, which has a component of an accountability model in it. Like you still have to face the harm that you've done, but in a way that you can walk away from it with an improvement in your self-esteem, your improvement in your skill set, so that when you go into a next situation, what additional tools do you now have in your tool belt that maybe you didn't have before, right? So I think that that can be a really exciting idea to try that on. I think that it's like everything. There has to be some guidance around it, some real training around it, so that and restorative justice. I don't know enough about it to be an expert on it by far, but I'm sure that there are some research out there that does it fit for all situations. It may or may not, but I think what we're also talking about is that idea of, when I was going back to when I was a diversion officer, it was for those kids that were starting out down this path, and how do we prevent that path from getting any deeper? And I think that there's a lot to be said for restorative justice in that path also,
Yeah, absolutely. And it's a great point. These empathy skills, when we consider what lessons have they been taught prior to entering the school about how to handle conflict, whether, sometimes students, we've seen in the BRO program, they basically learn to handle conflict through violence rather than, using your words or agreeing to disagree, or, just simply walking away, which can be
Right.
really helpful for a teenager, of course.
Mhm.
They might not always empathize, but over time, I think when you hear people's stories, you can kind of begin to connect with them. And they know when you're listening too. Um, I'm sure maybe you've experienced that as well, when an adult is taking the time to kind of figure out what's going on with them, what have they experienced versus, you walk in, you sit down and you do as you're told kind of thing.
Right. And as you were talking about this, the DV hat kind of came over it also, as far as, that's part of that model that we use in the PATE program, right, is an accountability model, right? Yes, they still have, the majority of them are court mandated, so that they have that external motivating factor is what we call it, right? Your probation officer is breathing down your neck in order for you to address this, but the program itself is really an accountability model, right? So that it really is trying to have them look at their behaviors and change their behaviors and learn from what they've done in the past, and do a shifting of their belief systems, right? And you can see where if you get into a pattern of crime punishment, where's the growth that these youth are able to learn from that, right? So I think that there's a lot of parallels that we could pull in between, this conversation and, of course, the domestic violence, which is always, why we're here, right?
Yeah,
Suburban
absolutely.
family shelter. Mm-hmm.
And that was exactly it. If we want kids to empathize, we have to put a system in place where we empathize with them, and really that they know that whether you're in the court system and you're setting up all these supports, that there's actually a hope for the future. And if you get rid of your record, you can go on to do something, and whether that's you want to go on to college or you want to do this or that these things, there's a reason behind it, and we're not just sticking you somewhere until you're 18 and then figure it out. So
Mm-hmm.
absolutely. Was there anything else you wanted to bring up before maybe we check up on questions?
I don't think, but my brain is still spinning, so we'll see what comes up.
Of course, we'll have another chance if anything does come up, but I want to see what's up with Celeste and Facebook if we have any questions.
Here I am, Zach. No questions so far, but we do have an interesting comment that I'll go ahead and read to you. So it says, when Zach shared the statistics about the disproportionate impacts on Black youth, both boys and girls, I was reminded that it's important to recognize that their race is not the risk factor. Our system's evaluation of their race is the risk factor.
That is so true. That is a really, really powerful statement. Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah, that's well said. And yeah, I mean, the only reason why we bring it up is just show, but that is a great point.
Mhm.
Thank you for that comment.
Yeah, no problem. But other than that, Zach, we don't have any questions so far.
Okay, I'll give everyone just another minute or so to see if anything comes up. And Celeste, if nothing comes up, I'll just leave it at that. So we talked a lot about lots of different things. The school to prison pipeline concept is, it'll be there to stay unless we make some good changes here. But hopefully this conversation can maybe spark an interest for people who either they have teenagers, they work with teenagers, or they will have teens, or and anyone in the community, of course. All those protective factors, everything helps a little bit. And I was listening to a restorative justice presentation, and one strategy a school used was they figured out how many kids were in the school and how many school staff were in the school, and they more or less assigned one staff member who had a connection with that student. So maybe I have like 10 students and they might not even be my kids, but I have this one student for I coach them, or I see this kid in the hallway or something every day. And that way you have at least one relationship with an adult in the school who might not even be your teacher, and just make extra connections, have extra lines of defense, to connect with that kid.
That is a tremendous idea, right? I mean, and that's not, it doesn't take extra funding. It doesn't take extra training. You hope that all of the educators that are in the school are there because they like kids and want to do what's best for kids, And so just that idea of them having human contact, you know what I mean? Going out of their way to say hi or something like that. That's one of the things, the high school that my student or my children go to or will be going to, that was one of the things that really struck me, is that as I was walking around the halls one day during some event, this specific school has a security force in it because of the numbers and whatever else reasons. But the officers knew the kids, knew them by name, went up and was just like, hey, saw you in the ball game. This is my thought. Hey, how are things going? You know what I mean? Giving them a handshake, giving them, some sort of contact. And you could see the difference on the children's face, or the youth face, right? We're talking high school. So they're up to the age of 17, 18, just that they felt seen and they felt valued, because an adult took the time to recognize who they were, and they didn't have to. You know what I mean? That officer could have just walked right past them and given them not the time of day, except for to say, pull up your pants, or, you know what I mean? Whatever that is, but they didn't. They really took that extra effort. And that's something that it's those small things that I think really stick with youth. So I think that that's a tremendous idea if there's a way that schools can replicate that,
Yeah, absolutely. And that does go a long way with, so they know if there's a school resource officer, they're not there just, I don't even know what the word is. They're just sweeping the halls and,
right.
kids in line, and they know that they're there to keep everyone safe. Unfortunately, there's
Right.
school shootings happen, and a lot of times it's helpful to have a responsible adult who's trained to handle the situations.
Right. Well, and I think that, adults think in job titles and in job responsibilities and where are the boundaries of what we're supposed to do. But kids don't think that way. Kids just see you as an adult. You know what I mean? And you might be a teacher, or you might be a coach, or you might be, and many times in schools, there are multiple things, right? Like your math teacher is also, your after school activities director, or whatever that may be. And so I think that when adults just get to be present with kids. I think, that's so powerful. That really is powerful,
So Zach, we do have one more comment.
Sure.
They're asking if you can each speak a little bit about what SSFS offers as far as protective factors for youth.
I think I can take this one. So at SSFS, we've had a prevention program for a very long time. So some aspect of that is K through 12 classroom-based presentations, age appropriate, so it changes depending on the age group. So K through second grade, we do our Hands Are Not for Hitting program, where we're talking about recognizing feelings and emotions in ourselves and as well as other people. That's like recognizing internal states as well as recognizing them on people based on their face and their, their body language. We also do, coping skills in the form of breathing. And then third, fourth, and fifth is we talk about family violence and how to stay safe in those relationships when that's happening in your household, as well as what is characteristics of healthy and good relationships as well, and how to problem solve healthily. And then the same for 6th through 12th grade, that's teen dating violence presentations, as well as healthy relationships, consent, and things along those lines. And then one of my favorite, hopefully now that we're rolling out this vaccine a little bit, we can start maybe getting our bro program back. The reason we couldn't really do it is we get, you can imagine a circle of 8 of us, very close quarters. We're doing activities, playing games. So we're way too close of contact for the pandemic. But that's a group for boys 5th through 8th grade who have been exposed to violence in the home or community. And we teach things like we were mentioning, accountability and respect and empathy and effective communication. So we've got those in place.
And then just to add to that, we also have counseling services. We've got counseling services not only the adult victims of domestic violence, which can be a protective factor as a really, we also built into the adult counseling program, we have parenting classes that we provide to our clients so that they can really learn, they can be reflective on their parenting techniques and their parenting modalities. But we also have counseling services for youth, and we do it actually from birth all the way up through the age of 18. If they have been a direct victim of domestic violence themselves, or if they've been a witness of domestic violence, we are a Safe from the Start provider, which is a statewide funded program through ICEJA, where it is for families or youth from birth up through their 6th birthday that have been exposed to any kind of trauma. It doesn't have to necessarily be domestic violence, but within that, we're doing individual counseling if the kiddos are able to, if they're old enough for that. If not, if they're younger kiddos, then we're doing parent-infant bonding. We're doing family sessions so that we really are working with the parents and the caregivers to recognize what their children are going through and to be able to help them develop tools to counteract the trauma that their child has witnessed or experienced themselves. And then we also have a housing program, whether it's emergency shelter, whether that's transitional housing, or whether that's rapid rehousing, where we're able to have a supportive environment for kids that have been facing homelessness, in addition to facing domestic violence within their family structure. So those are some of the programs that we provide that I think really addresses kind of how we try and include or improve supportive systems around children.
And I was just checking my notes real quick. Did we mention Safe from the Start as well?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Sorry, I had to make sure we covered everything today.
I'm sure we probably forgot one program that I'll hear about later, but yeah.
Well, thank you, Celeste. Think we'll close for the questions there. Carol, was there anything else that you wanted to mention? Floor is yours.
I am just, like I said at the beginning, I'm just super excited about this topic. One thing, Zach, that we didn't mention that you and I had talked about is that unfortunately, so if there's any people that want to donate lots of money for a new program, if you happen to be on this Facebook chat, that one of the things that is missing when it comes to services is that there's not a lot of programming for youth offenders of domestic violence, right? So we can provide the counseling services and the victim support services, but our abuser intervention program is for offenders over the age of 18. So if it's, here we are at the end of teen dating violence, and for those youth under the age of 18 that have found themselves being the aggressor in the relationship, the one that has been using violence in the relationship, there's not a lot of programs out there for them. And so that's something that our agency has recognized. We see it as an issue. We see it as something that needs to be addressed. We just haven't been able to do that yet. But it is something that we realize needs to be addressed at some way and in some system, not only through South Suburban Family Shelter, but across all other domestic violence agency and social service agencies as well.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Carol, for being a guest again.
Sure, no problem.
And thanks everyone for listening and commenting and following along. I really liked this conversation, and I think there's a lot to it. Turn these trends around a little bit, and we'll be back next week. Same place, same time, a little bit different tea, but we'll see you all then.
All right. Thank you much.
Bye, everyone.